the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference. And I'm Jenny Browngen, and I'm very happy you're here today for this breakout session that's Social Work Without Mandated Reporting, Transforming Our Practices, Organizing Our Schools and Communities. To share just a brief visual description of me, I'm an older white woman with shoulder-length red hair, wearing glasses, and I have a blue sweater and a black jacket for my clothing. I'd like to again share our university's land acknowledgement. The University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work occupy ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Tejob since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. The history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. I have a few then quick housekeeping notes that this presentation is being recorded and will be available on our conference website at a later date. Before I introduce our speakers, there's just a few Zoom information updates for you. To access this presentation, you are required to provide your name and email and your information on this allows us to log into our attendees and email you information on CEUs for this presentation, which will be distributed via email at a later date. Your cameras and microphones will be your cameras and microphones will remain muted, but we do have a Q&A feature where you can submit questions for our presenters. Please know that due to a large number of attendees, we will not be able to get to all questions submitted. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters, Tamia Govan, Jasmine Wali, and Eleni Zimiles. And I probably mispronounced your name, so please correct me once you are on. We are so fortunate to have Tamia, Jasmine, and Eleni with us today to share the ways they have organized on meso and macro levels to end or reduce mandated reporting, and how you can replicate this work at your own school or agency. I will now let each of them introduce themselves and share a bit more about their background and start their session today. Thank you, and thank you for your patience for our difficulties getting it all started.
Thank you so much for having us. And I'm so excited to be here with you all. My name is Jasmine Wali. I am a Chinese and Afghan woman with light skin, with fake blonde hair that is tied up, wearing glasses and a black sweater. I'm so honored to be here with you all today to talk about mandated reporting. I'm currently a policy consultant working on legislation and research in New York, California, and Massachusetts to reduce, shrink, or eliminate mandated reporting, as well as a national group to change federal policy. I'm also from Wisconsin, so it's nice to be here with you all. I was also part of a group of students, alumni, and faculty from Columbia School of Social Work and community partners from JMAC for Families who wrote the mandated supporting curriculum. And I led the implementation of the curriculum and framework at schools of social work and across New York. And I'm really excited to be here and presenting with my co-presenters, and I'll pass it to Tamia.
Thanks, Jasmine. My name is Tamia Govan, and I am from New Jersey. I am currently employed with the state of New Jersey. I work in the Office of Family Voice within the Department of Children and Family Services, but today I am here in my personal capacity. So any of the statements that I say are my own, and they do not represent the state of New Jersey in any way. I am a Black woman, 42, and proud of it. I am wearing a purple sweater that is a lighter shade and a darker shade. And I have my hair pulled back into an Afro power puff. And I am really happy to be here today to have this conversation with you about mandated reporting. And I will pass to Eleni.
Thanks, Tamia. Hi, everyone. My name is Eleni Zimiles. I use she and they. I'm a white femme with pulled back brown hair, wearing a green turtleneck, long silver earrings, and have a white background. I'm here right now in New York City, where I'm from, 5th generation Brooklynite. I'm a school social worker and adjunct professor in New York City social work programs. And most importantly for this conversation, I'm a co-founder and organizer with Mandated Reporters Against Mandated Reporting. And I really see this organizing work as some like core work for myself, as a reckoning for the harm that I've done myself as a social worker in the communities I've worked with, and to challenge the particular ways that social work has infiltrated and polices the Black communities in our country, and see this as like a moral demand to change our behavior, our field, and the system that we're within. And so I'm very excited to be here, and we'll pass it on to Jasmine.
Hopefully, I'm not sure tech-wise where we're at with polling, but maybe for time constraints, we can skip this part of the poll and we have some poll questions later on. But some important terms I just want to ground us in. We, throughout this presentation,
Jasmine, I'm sorry, this is Tracy. Would you like me to do the polls? I can put them up real quick.
It's okay. I think we're short on time.
Okay.
But thank you. In this presentation, we will use the term family policing system to refer to what's commonly known as the child welfare system. Part of our reasoning is language is really important. And with this presentation and in our work, we want to challenge the false narratives that have been built around the family policing system. We use the words family policing, family regulation, because we've heard from people who have been impacted by the system, both as youth and parents, and shouldered the harm of this system, that there is no welfare or protection in this system. We will use the term CPS to refer to Child Protective Services. I might say the word CAPTA, but that refers to a federal piece of legislation called the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. And that is what defines mandated reporting in the US. And we'll get more into the history of this and more into the specifics a little bit later. And finally, mandated reporting. Hopefully, if you selected to come to this session, you're somewhat familiar, but this is the legal requirement enforced by states, defined by CAPTA, but further defined by states, to report any suspicion of child abuse or neglect. And one thing I'll mention too, while CAPTA sets the minimum standard for state mandatory reporting laws, it doesn't explicitly name the professions. And within mandated reporting, often states define who is a mandated reporter, what constitutes as a reportable offense. And furthermore, within agencies, agencies also define their own agency policy. I'll pass to you, Eleni.
Great, thank you. So we're gonna just go through a little bit of just to give you all a little bit of a sense of how we're structuring this. We're gonna go through like sort of a basic overview, and then we're gonna jump into a conversation between the three of us to really ground of like, what are the ways that we're seeing mandated reporting show up, and how are we gonna transform our practice? So just starting with a baseline of mandated reporting is a racial justice issue. And in fact, it's actually not just a racial justice issue, it's a reproductive justice issue, it's gender, it's a class justice, it's a settler colonial issue. And using this intersectional lens, we want to make sure that we see the different ways that reporting regulates, surveils, and polices families, and particularly Black, Brown, and Indigenous individuals and families. And that the first part of transforming our practice and who we are as social workers is to truly and bravely face the reality of harm and trauma that has happened, the history of our field, what we have done in our communities, and the intersectional, the interconnected ways that the oppressions have manifested. And that we have to base our social work strategies on what we know about this and how we name it. And so Black families are distinctly and systematically being harmed by what we have learned to call the child welfare system. And so we need to really call it what it is. That's a state-run program that disrupts, restructures, and polices Black families, families of color, and poor families. Next slide. So mandated reporting relies on vague definitions of neglect that are interpreted to include symptoms of poverty. Jasmine's going to get into a little bit of the history later of why we got here. But something we know is that mandated reporting is the system of regulations enforcing the reporting of abuse and neglect. And we're taught in social work school that this is because of safety. And in public discourse as well, we think about reporting and often actually talk about abuse as the main reason why people make calls. But actually, when we're talking about what happens with mandated reporting, that most calls, the vast majority in New York City is where I'm from, but also mirrors the national calls, is actually 70% of calls are around neglect. And why is this? That really makes us demand, like, what is it about that? And according to ACS, neglect is defined as the failure of a parent or caretaker to provide needed food, clothing, shelter, medical care, or supervision to the degree that the child's health, safety, and well-being are threatened with harm. And so these neglect categories like really ignore a fundamental social work perspective of understanding a person within the context of their environment. And so how do we examine these situations of so-called neglect and look through with an anti-racist lens to understand the historical and systemic inequities? For example, when we look at the definitions of neglect, how are they actually symptoms of poverty and be reread as systemic needs, right? And we'll talk more about what that can look like. But when we say that there's a childcare issue, when there's a food issue, is there around neglect, is it actually food scarcity? Is there a housing issue? And really trying to rename those for what they are. Next. Great, thanks. So implicit and explicit racial biases held by social workers, service providers, educators, contribute to an overrepresentation of Black, Indigenous, and low-income families in the family policing system. And we see the overrepresentation of these children in every single part of the process, from reporting to the investigations to what services are provided to who gets removed. And this doesn't, we see that studies show that the actual incidence of child maltreatment is actually no greater in any one group. So it doesn't account for why there's an overrepresentation in every single one of these ways in reporting. And so what does that actually look like? And we're gonna unpack some of this of like what those biases are and how that can show up. But we see that because 53% of Black children will experience a CPS report. And in some states, this number is as high as 79%. I want us to just like literally sit with what that means around what children in communities experience and how prolific an experience this is in community spaces. And also, what does it mean, before I get into like, what does this look like in Wisconsin? Of like, what does it actually look like to be outraged by this? Right? I think we can talk later about it's when we saw people at the southern border, when children were put in cages and detainment camps, we saw this public outrage. And what does it look like for us to have that same feeling when we're talking about the family policing system? So let's just look quickly about what that looks like in Wisconsin. So in Wisconsin, 35,119 reports of child maltreatment were made in 2022. That was actually from a total of 73,000 CPS access referrals. And so 88% of those reports were found unsubstantiated. So thinking about the intrusion that happens for families once these calls are made. And Tamia is going to really get into that and to think about the reach of the family policing system, how it actually rivals what we more commonly talk about when we talk about the criminal justice system. And so I'm going to pass it to Tamia to get into sort of what the realities of that are.
The next slide, please, Jasmine. Even when reports are unsubstantiated, families experience the trauma of government intrusion, the stress of potential family separation, the ongoing distrust of the system that reported them. So as Eleni shared, 53% of Black children will experience a CPS investigation. 53%, more than half of Black children in this country will experience this intrusion, this violation. And I can tell you as a mother that I, as a Black mother in particular, I have had this very same experience. One of my children, when they were in elementary school, went to school and shared with the school that she had been spanked the night before. And that evening, a child protective worker showed up at my home. Fortunately for me, it was one of those days when my house was not in disrepair. I mean, not disrepair, but disorder, right? You have kids and everything's not always in its place at all times. However, I never quite recovered, and it was unsubstantiated, right? Nothing, my children were not taken away from me, but just the thought, the seed that was planted from that moment forth, that my children could go to a school, and in my instance, it was a private Christian school that I sent them to, a school in which I knew the people that were going, that I was entrusting my children to their care. I went to church with them every Sunday, and yet, because of the pressures of mandated reporting, these people, they didn't come to me as a parent to talk, as a person, to talk to me, to explain to me what their concerns were. Instead, they just dialed a hotline number and created all kinds of confusion and anxiety within my family, within my home. You know, when we think about mandated reporting as it being a protective measure for children, we have to recognize that call, the call itself is harmful for families. There are real instances of child abuse and neglect that happen in this country and in the world. But as Eleni shared, right, that doesn't occur within the Black community in any more proportion than in any other community. Yet, 53% of Black children are experiencing this trauma at the hands of a system that calls itself a child protective system. Jasmine is completely on point when she describes this system as a family policing system, because what it does is it surveils marginalized communities, and whenever you're looking for something and you're looking for it enough, you will find it. I still, to this day, when I think about what my family experienced when that person showed up at my house, came into the rooms of my home, spoke to my children, the impact of that, not only on me as a mother, but on my children, that they were anxious when the doorbell rang, when we weren't expecting anyone for some time after that. That doesn't protect children. You know, there are many Black children who are living in circumstances that have its own set of traumas. They shouldn't be experiencing trauma at the hands of the state, at the hand of a system that purports to be a system in which these children are going to be protected. Jasmine is now going to share more about the history of mandated reporting that led to these sort of instances that I just described from my own personal experience.
One thing I want to expand upon that Tamia was talking about was, you know, the fear that families are experiencing when a caseworker comes to their door. children can be strip searched. Children can be questioned without their parents present. Parents are living with this fear for the next 60 to 90 days that their kid could be taken from them at any moment. This slide really speaks to what the research points to, and what, if you talk to someone who's been impacted, can tell you, that it completely changes the way that they relate to this system or this community organization. And when you're talking about schools that are reporting families, or hospitals that are reporting, or clinics, essential places of care, places where people are getting healthcare, places where people are getting childcare, and feeling pushed out, or feeling fear of who reported me. Why couldn't they just have talked to me? What happened in our relationship that scared them from talking to me, right? Consistently, what I hear from parents is, why didn't you just talk to me, right? What happened to this relationship building? And, we'll get into relationship building a little bit more, but I want us to frame, this history, and understanding how we've moved into an individualized way of care within the social work practice. And part of why I am really interested in history and the history of mandated reporting, actually there's this quote from a social work scholar named Michael Reisch, who's written extensively about social work history and the profession. And he writes, we are an ahistorical culture that has become accustomed to fragments of information instead of the connective tissue. Our current and cultural and political institutions, including the social work profession, perpetuate ignorance of the past in order to sustain the perception of the present as a given. And I lead with that because I'm going to go over some pieces of history that might not make sense, if you just hear about them one-on-one, but I want us to connect these moments and see how they have led us to this system of mandated reporting, and also how we can move forward and make changes.
Jasmine, I just want to jump in because I forgot to point out the fact that most of the calls to the child abuse hotline come from people that police officers and the schools and medical professionals. These are all places where people go to receive help and support. And then it ends in this trauma. It can end in this trauma. I just wanted to point out that those are the three places where it happens the most.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so in 1935, FDR signs the New Deal, which creates welfare and cash assistance for families. Black families were largely excluded from receiving these benefits through a variety of tactics. In the South, the jobs that Black families held, or Black individuals held, were omitted from receiving these benefits. There were attacks on the family structure that were written into law, specifically around unmarried parents who were unable to receive welfare benefits, under this original passage of welfare. This isn't on the timeline, but something I want to mention is that 2 years after this, 1938, Bertha Capon Reynolds, who was the associate dean at Smith College School of Social Work, was actually fired for being outspoken about the structural inequities. She was really vocal about critiquing the New Deal because she was reframing beliefs about the causes of poverty from being about individual failings, which hopefully, the social work has a long history of perpetuating. But she was reframing the cause of poverty as being structural deficits and capitalism itself. And she was outspoken. She was, one of the most published authors of the time, but she was fired from her position as the associate dean and then blacklisted by other schools of social work, frequently targeted and subject to government intrusion and investigation. This is in the time period that McCarthyism is becoming more prominent, right? So Progressive soon becomes a coded term for individuals who are linked to or sympathetic to the Communist Party. And at this time, other social work practitioners and professionals and professors, who pointed to structural failings rather than individual or family deficits were also labeled as progressives. So with that, think about how the McCarthy era crushed labor unions. That happened within the social work profession too. McCarthyism crushed social work unions. So without the protection of labor unions and progressive leadership like Bertha Capon Reynolds, social work faculties were dismissed from their universities and agencies. Most social workers who wanted to keep their job or didn't want to end up on a blacklist distanced themselves from radical policies, quote unquote radical policies, radical ideas that pointed to structural inequity as the root of poverty. And really the social work profession embraced the idea of individual and family interventions to address poverty. So I want y'all to imagine how that shapes the next generation of social workers. The authors of your books are all embracing this idea of individual pathology or individual failings. The professors who are teaching your classes are all embracing this idea of family and individual deficit. The supervisors who are providing your case consultation are all embracing the idea of individual deficit over structural deficit. So that shapes a whole generation throughout the 1940s through 1960s. Honestly provided the intellectual foundation that moved social policy away from New Deal era policies towards more individualized rehabilitation programs. 1954 through 1968, we see the civil rights movement, right? And the visibility of Black freedom fighters and other groups fighting for racial justice. And we'll return to that in a minute. But 1962, C. Henry Kemp publishes The Battered Child Syndrome. So this was a really foundational text that put child abuse on the map. These authors were specifically looking at children's x-rays in hospitals and determining that there was this phenomenon of unreported and untreated severe physical abuse towards children. So when they published this report, it was groundbreaking. Academics, media, the government publicized this issue and really started talking about child abuse. And just to give you a sense of how groundbreaking this was, in the decade prior to the article being published, there were only 9 articles published on child abuse from 1952 to 1962. In the decade after, from 1962 to 1972, there were 260 articles, right? So we went from 9 to 260 articles. So mass explosion of interest and research and money being poured into this topic. You started seeing this issue on TV. You started seeing child abuse talked about in soap operas and newspapers. And like I said, the federal funding for research on child abuse skyrocketed. 3 years later, Daniel Patrick Moynihan publishes the Moynihan Report, which was really another groundbreaking and foundational report that shaped political discussions around Black families. It shaped dinner discussions, right, around Black parenting and welfare. And I'm gonna show y'all some highlights from newspaper articles that from the time that really speak to the ways that things were framed. But first I wanna look at the language. So these paragraphs are pulled from the 2 reports. The Moynihan Report language is on the left-hand side and the Battered Child Syndrome is on the right. And I want y'all to notice the similarity in themes and language and words that are used to describe 2 separate groups of parents. You have one group who is described, Black parents and Black children described on the left, and parents who physically abuse their children on the right, right? So I'm seeing words like pathology over and over again in the Moynihan Report. I'm seeing warnings about the future of Black youth and this quote unquote inherent pathology. I'm seeing descriptions of family pathology, divorce, separation, female family head, children in broken homes, illegitimacy. And on the right, to describe parents who physically abuse their children, I'm seeing similar words, right? Psychopathic or sociopathic. I'm seeing critiques on marriage structure. I'm seeing the idea that pregnancies are unwanted or illegitimate. And so a lot of this, so these are two groundbreaking reports of the time, using the same language, using the same themes, and ultimately conflating these two separate groups of parents. So I'm gonna kind of go quickly through some of these slides, but these are some screenshots of various newspaper articles pulled from, I think, between 1965 to 1970. So I'm seeing, critiques on blaming mothers, right? So a lot of blame on mothers right here. The visibility of child abuse, right? Judge suggests jail for unwed mothers, right? Critiquing mothers who are not married. The idea that unwed mothers of 3 or more children could be jailed, right? And this was really mirroring a lot of the language that was written in the Moynihan report, which pointed to illegitimacy, quote unquote, in Black families as a reason for Black families receiving welfare. Mothers warned on illegitimacy. So in this case, a mother or a judge declared that, if you have 9 or more, there were 3 parents, I believe, in this case that had 3 or more children, and it was determined that they were neglecting their children solely because they had given birth to more than 1 illegitimate child. The Saturday Evening Post is posting constantly about this welfare mess, pointing to this, concern about this overspending on government funding. Mothers without joy. The number of illegitimate babies born in America is reaching alarming new heights. So what kind of message is that sending to you if you're just reading this paper, right? What kind of language, inflammatory language, is this promoting about parents on welfare? This was from the Saturday Evening Post, but it was also submitted into congressional record about what to do about this welfare crisis. But I want to highlight, the result of all this is a growing welfare society. Unless some answer is found, this sub-society is destined to increase in size, dollar cost, and indirect cost. It is certain to breed more criminals, more mental defectives, more unemployables of almost every type. Like I said, federal funding is increasing. And I bring these examples up to show how inflammatory the language was around Black parenting, inflammatory language around parents receiving welfare. And this idea that we have to do something right now, right? This inflammatory language about children who are experiencing physical abuse, and how these types of headlines and these types of articles and this type of rhetoric that's submitted into congressional record creates this panic and creates political clout, and creates a political moment for us, for politicians to move laws that then, harm families. So, as a result of the civil rights movement and a lot of the activism, Black and Latino women start receiving more welfare benefits. And that's, in part, that welfare mess that one of the news articles relate or write about. But just to be more specific on this, it's not that more families were poor and needed welfare. It was that the civil rights movement and activists pushed for more eligible families to receive what they were entitled to. So you see welfare experiencing 110% expansion. At this time, like I said, with the social work profession, moving away from structural critiques, moving towards the pathology of individualized families and communities. We're seeing that reflected in policymaking itself. Congress passes with bipartisan support the Comprehensive Child Development Act. This would have provided subsidized universal childcare for all families. And Nixon vetoes it. And in his speech, he says, this is the most radical piece of legislation I've ever seen. This is a communal way of raising children. He uses this language that is reminiscent of McCarthy era tactics to critique this anti-poverty program, right? And place more blame on individual families and more responsibility on individual families and away from this idea of communities taking care of each other, right? When he says this is a communal way of raising children, subsidized childcare is a communal way of raising children, right? So he vetoes it. And the sponsor of that act at the time, he still wants to do something about children. He's feeling the political pressure from the inflammatory language that I laid out earlier. And he proposes and passes the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, or CAPTA, which is, as I mentioned, what codifies mandated reporting and is still in practice today, and makes a certain amount of federal dollars reliant on states having a system of mandated reporting. Before I pass to Eleni, I give, like I said, I give that history to ground us in the way that this practice, is deeply rooted in anti-Blackness. And when we think about moving forward, right now, I think our profession is at an inflection point. We are really talking and grappling with this issue of mandated reporting. In the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, social work students and Black social workers really organized to move the profession away from participating in harmful welfare enforcement. They changed school curriculum away from this individualized practice towards more a systems-based approach. They protested social work's lack of response to Black liberation movements. All of this organizing done by students and younger social workers and social workers of color led to the emergence of the systems perspective, which is now foundational to the social work practice, right? So I want to end this history piece by highlighting, what we can do in this moment as future social workers, or I think many of your students, what responsibility can you take in changing the profession that's based in a history of student organizing? And with that, I'll pass to Eleni.
Thank you, Jasmine. I just feel like every time I hear the history, and I was saying this to Jasmine, Tamia, the other day, it's like a process of disorienting myself to all the ways that I was taught in social work school about the history of social work and their relationships with families. And so just encouraging, right, of like, what does it mean to disorient ourselves to the way that traditionally social workers have been taught, and to reorient ourselves towards this incredible organizing history that Jasmine just ended on. And what does it mean to really politicize ourselves as social workers? And so we want to sort of move now to a more open discussion between the three of us in getting to what the title of our presentation is really the point of this, which is how can we actually imagine a social work profession without mandated reporting? And what does it look like to truly transform our practice? And something that the three of us have talked a lot about, but also the group that Jasmine and I have been a part of around dismantling mandated reporting has been looking at these micro, meso, and macro levels of in what ways have we actually internalized a culture of reporting? And then how does that influence and manifest in our practices, the way that we see ourselves? How does that look in our relationships with our coworkers, with the children, with the families that we work with our supervisors? What does that look like on a procedural level? The policies in our organization, in our industry, right? In schools and hospitals, and what does that look like as a social work profession? And so the question that, like we want to sort of discuss together is, in what ways do we each uphold the regulation and policing of families in our personal practices, our organizations, and profession? And how can we address this harm, and how do we cultivate alternatives? We want to be clear that the alternatives, right? Actually, communities have created alternatives to the system of care for a long, long time. So it's not always about creating something new, but about what are we fostering that actually has more of family care, family unification, family safety, community connectedness in mind. So we're thinking that we're gonna structure this conversation in sort of in those three levels. So really, maybe we'll start our conversation with the micro, right? And so into this internalized piece of what messages have we really internalized about ourselves and others that perpetuates the family policing system. So I guess something that I'd love to maybe start the conversation with the three of us on that is differentiating this hard policing. I think we talked about police as like the police department, and what does it look like, the soft policing of the verb, right, of policing ourselves and policing each other. And something that I know for myself as a social worker, having to really look at my identity and experiences to see how has that shaped my idea of who is a good parent and what counts as safety and care. I don't know if somebody wants to jump in from this, or I can keep on going.
I'll go ahead and jump in here, Eleni. I'm connecting, what you just shared and the history that Jasmine shared, and I think about the history in this country of family separation. You mentioned what happened, at the border, and everyone was in an outrage when those children were separated and put into cages. But we have a history in this country of Black parents being separated, that it predates, the history that Jasmine just shared with us. It goes all the way back to slavery. And Black parents were separated from their children. And if they showed proper emotion, if they were upset, if they were outraged, they risked being, whipped or beaten and assaulted. And now we have this soft policing that when a person's child is removed from them, if you show up with a proper, normal, expected rage and fury that you should show when your child is being removed from you, that is used against you, right? I think the phrase I used the other day was like, the most egregious act that the government could commit would be to remove a child from their parents. And the first step in that process, that first step in that removal, is a phone call to the hotline. And as mandated reporters, that's where we come in, right? And that's where we have to change our lens, how we determine what exactly is abuse and neglect, so that we're not making calls erroneously and causing this harm. And what's really difficult is that with this self-policing, a person has to prove a negative, right? You have to prove that you didn't do something. So if they show up at your house to do an investigation and they find out, maybe you don't have heat because you can't afford it, they came because you were accused of child abuse or neglect, but now they find out that you have this problem, and now you have a bigger issue, right? Now they remove your child from you because of an issue of poverty, not because of willful neglect. That's a systemic issue, not a personal issue. And that's why it's really important that we talk about this in the context of the micro, the meso, and the macro, because all of those things, not living in a communal way, is exactly how we've gotten to where we are right now.
And when I think about, how the way that, okay, I'm thinking of this example. And I think most people in the US grow up learning that we have to be careful of people taking advantage of us. No matter your socioeconomic status, I think there's this persistent thread that you always have to be careful of somebody taking advantage of you. A couple months ago, I was working with a parent who, there's this parent's school had an issue with a lot of neglect cases being called for dirty clothes. And so the school, in response to, how do we address this issue without bringing in CPS, actually got a laundry machine in the basement. And so allowed for parents to come, or students to use the laundry machine so that they could, make less calls for dirty clothes. The problem was that they still kept making these calls. And a lot of these calls came from parents who were, teachers or educators who were feeling like parents were taking advantage of this laundry machine. They were using it too much, right? And I think I've worked in agencies, I've worked in, prevention services. There's this persistent theme that we can support someone for so long, right? We can only support somebody for 2 weeks. We could give this parent so many bus tokens. We can provide so many diapers, and then they're kind of on their own, right? And then they're taking advantage of us. If they ask for too many bus tokens, I'm being played, right? And I think we grow up with these ideas passed down from us, from policymakers, but also our families, and also our communities, that we are then enforcing and policing on the families that we are tasked to provide support to. So that's just an example I was thinking of bias.
Yeah, and it's just so true, Jasmine, that this notion that we're going to provide temporary assistance for a problem that will persist beyond that time period, right? It's not like we've done anything to change these folks' circumstance, but we've limited the support that we're going to offer to them, and then hold them, penalize them when they're not able to provide those things after we've taken away the support that they've needed.
I think something, it's so important, Jasmine, how you brought up this thing, this persistent feeling of we can only support people up into a point and then we're going to take advantage of, again, around like how racialized that is and how important it is to name that, of like who can we give persistent support to? And I think something when I brought up is like the micro of how are we perceiving various things that, Tamia is mentioning around like why reports get made, of seeing like how does racial bias play into each one of those. And so something that like I've seen, and right now I work at one school, but I used to work on a district level where I worked with 30 schools in a Brooklyn school district. And something that I saw across the schools was that certain things, depending on the racial makeup of the schools, were seen as a problem. So like the idea of younger students taking the train by themselves. So obviously this is a little different, maybe in Wisconsin, not having as much public transportation, right? But of thinking like a 10-year-old in a predominantly Black school taking the subway was a cause for concern, and saying like that's a childcare issue. Whereas even myself taking the train at 10 years old from white families, seeing it like it's a sign actually of independence, right? An empty refrigerator in some families, right? And so no matter what you call for, there's going to be an investigation in the home and checking out your refrigerator, things that like don't have anything to do with necessarily what you've what the call is being made for. Like an empty refrigerator might mean that there's child maltreatment, but it also could just mean like, oh, that mother works so hard and is really busy and this has just been an off week. And when do we also give that leniency to certain families and not others? And where does that come from in our own, also like our own experiences, that we have an eye towards something?
So when
Like someone's like, I
my
gotta get in on that.
my thoughts are in lots of places, and I'm thinking about, when we think about the lens through which, many folks are showing up to make the evaluation of what's happening in a home, right? It usually is a white middle class lens through which the evaluation is being made, as they're showing up into communities that are not from a white middle class perspective. And so it's very easy to label, right, that empty refrigerator as neglect, instead of accepting the fact that this may be a family where mom or dad has to go to the grocery store every single day. And that's not an issue of neglect. That's just these folks are getting by day. And so understanding that even the lens through which we show up to examine a thing can make us see things in a way that isn't actually accurate to what the family is experiencing or what the family needs.
And I want to connect this, actually, what you just said to me, to one of the questions in here about like funding. And I think that I've seen in so many organizations, there's so much stress on employees that it's like actually building relationships with families it's like there's too high caseloads. It's sort of like a passing the buck by calling CPS. And I think it's important to think about this when we get into, like, when we try to shift into a macro lens of like, wait, the real thing that we need to address is our lack of resources in this organization or in this school, instead of like, oh, the lack of resources, right, of this parent. And unfortunately, right, like anti-poverty work is not as, like, it's not very easy. And I think that challenges some of the this like internal work of saying like, oh, we're here to help people and to support people. And I truly do believe that social workers do come in wanting that, wanting to do that, wanting to build real authentic relationships with people. And yet, because of these systems that we are working in, it's leading us to say like, oh, the only thing I can do to help is to make this call. And what does it look like for us to actually face the realities of what happens when we make the calls? And does it make it better? And I think that that's actually what brought me to the organizing work, was saying like, let me just think about the students that I had to make calls for. What happened? And being honest, like, it actually, none of it got better, and it actually only got worse. And that's a really hard thing to sit with. But I feel is really important in terms of our work in reimagining this.
Something I'll add, I talk to parents who've been impacted by the system often about mandated reporting. And like I said earlier, the consistent theme is, I just needed to feel listened to. I needed someone to build a relationship with me. I needed really just for someone to really hear me and what I was saying, rather than hear me to maybe make a report. And your point, Eleni, about the lack of resources and funding that's made available for a robust network of social workers at a school. Sometimes there's one social worker at a school that serves, hundreds of children. I'm reminded of a meeting that we had in our Mandated Reporters Against Mandated Reporting group near the holidays last year. And we were talking about burnout that happens in the holidays, right? Because we see that cases or reports go up in the winter months. And part of that is attributed to, the colder weather and, more reportable, quote unquote, offenses like not having a coat. But also I think when we think about what causes us to make a report, and this passing of the buck or the passing of the liability to someone else. And I think a participant in the group at the time mentioned how, it might have been you, Eleni, actually, who talked about how we're all feeling family stress in December. We're all feeling the same stressors that parents are feeling or that families are feeling. Social workers are feeling that too. And we don't have the resources to build a stronger, community or build stronger relationships. And we're just burning ourselves out and not giving social workers, a chance to hold that human experience while also having this intense power to make a call on a family. And I think even that awareness of like, when we sit in these trainings about, how do we support families during the holidays? How are you also experiencing the same stressors that families are experiencing? And how do you build your idea of reducing burnout? Because burnout creates the condition for higher reports to being made.
Jasmine, I'm listening to what you're saying, and I'm thinking about what Charla, who was the one of the keynote speakers in the at the beginning of the conference today, and she said, social workers, I'm paraphrasing here, but social workers show up they may show up in neighborhoods that they don't live in to help those people over there. And would you make the same decisions if it were in your neighborhood? And what she said that I wrote down, the actual quote, is she said, I'm not going to poison the water in my own neighborhood because I have to drink it too. And I think about the fact that, making that phone call and sending, a CPS worker to someone's home, is that happening in your neighborhood? As a social worker, are you living in fear that a CPS worker is going to show up at your door? How many folks in the professional live with that fear upon them as a regular basis, or have experienced it as a weapon of other people in the community calling against them because they know that is a tool to create havoc within one's family? So I'm just thinking about this concept, right, of being acutely aware of not wanting to poison the water in your own neighborhood because you have to drink it too. So I just want us to think about being incredibly careful about what we're doing simply because it's those people over there, and having a sense and awareness that injustice in someone else's neighborhood has a negative effect on you as well, right? Homelessness exists because of grave injustice. Racism, ageism, all of the isms exist because of injustice, and it impacts us all, even if we happen to benefit from it at certain times. So I just wanted to raise that point because I thought when Charla made that this morning, that this afternoon, that it was really critical to think about that.
Thanks, Tamia. I feel like we're already sort of moving into this like our relationships to one another. And there's a few questions in the chat, I think, that are about both, it's like, again, solution oriented, and like what happens when like our organizations are in this like liability mindset. And so for us to like move the conversation more intentionally around the this meso level around our relationships and our organizational practices. And, I think something that we see a lot in the mandated reporters organizing group is people like want to go right away to what alternatives there are. And actually this practice of reflection feels like one of the biggest solutions that we can come up with, because it will lead us to policy changes. It will lead us to procedural changes, but us needing to actually reflect about like how are we seeing a culture of criminalization and policing in our supervision practices, in the ways that we do case conferencing. How are we seeing it show up? And what actual mutual aid systems are there already in existence? Right, so we're saying like, oh, sometimes we can, like ACS will bring in resources and funding, but actually like what's already in the communities that we work with. And you actually sort of, like I'll use the example for a Midwestern one. Illinois, for a long time, criminalized kinship care. So neglect, parents were often being called upon for having a relative watching a child, and that was considered neglect. And then years later, from lots of organizing from impacted parents, kinship care is now like one of the ways actually that like a CPS actually responds, right? Of saying like, oh, can we place a child with an aunt, with a grandma, etc. Which again goes back to like how important it is to organizing, but to think about like what systems are actually already in the communities that we are in and working within.
I'll talk a little bit about, so Mandated Reporters Against Mandated Reporting that Eleni co-founded is an organizing space that meets monthly, that provides what I would kind of call informal supervision or informal peer consultation. So it's a space where social workers and people who are mandated reporters come and talk through difficult situations. I don't know how to support a child that has come to me with this concern, or I don't know how to navigate this systemic barrier. And I think that model is one, really important, but also two, replicatable. It can be replicated, right? This idea that we can provide peer supervision for each other. And one thing I always like to highlight is that agencies and schools and nonprofits are a business at the end of the day, right? They're accountable to who pays their bills, right? Because they have to pay all their employees. So their concern, in addition to concern for families, is also this liability aspect. And supervisors are often tasked with upholding the agency, right? Which includes ensuring that this agency cannot get sued. So when you think about your supervisor who may be juggling other responsibilities to other stakeholders in this case, how might that interaction, how might your consultation with your supervisor be impacted by this broader systemic force of liability? And how can we form relationships with other social workers in our agency or in other agencies or other states to talk through the same issues that we're seeing, to really have honest discussions about difficult circumstances without worrying if there are other stakeholders' interests at play. And so I think the idea of peer supervision, and Eleni had written out some ideas for peer supervision that we could get into later. But I think that's a very, that's a practice that you all could replicate with your own networks too.
Something that, Jasmine pointing around peer supervision is like creating our own pods wherever we are, whether it is like social workers in Madison, if it's like school social workers in the region, is right. Having these accountability systems outside of your workplace is extremely important. And then also to use those as like experiment spaces to think about like, what does it look like of how can we change our organization's culture? So I know someone asked a question around there being sort of a liability culture. And I'm like, there are actually really small ways that we as social workers can influence that culture. And one simple way, right, it can actually be like pausing. To be like, when someone comes, and I'll say this today, actually, it's at the school I work with, it was like, oh, should we make a call? And I was like, let's think about this. Like, instead of just like rushing to and thinking about like the white supremacist cultural value of urgency, I mean, like, actually, like, nothing is going to happen right now. We actually need to think about what this could look like and how can we be creative about like all the different options that we have. And Like, what is the context? Like, how can we take a little bit of time on the context? And to someone else's point, question in here is like, what does it actually mean to bring in our students' voice and experience? Like, I thought it was an interesting thing. It's like, that often happens in our group where like, oh, was the student asked like what they thought would be a good plan? Was the parent brought in, right? Like, I think there's also it can be a culture of secrecy of like, oh, we're going to call, but we can't let someone know because it's going to make them angry. And you're like, well, of course it's going to make them angry. Maybe we can bring them in to say like, well, this is our reality. What can we do together? And that's really hard. Right? I mean, like, that is really, really hard. They're like, I'm going to make a call with a parent. I'm going to talk with a parent about like what the school or what the hospital, whatever, wherever we work, what they're dealing with. But of thinking of like, if we truly believe in self-determination and autonomy, that we have to bring in voices, and that can lead to us thinking about different responses. And I want to like bring in Tamia, because I feel like Tamia, this is so your bag around parent voice and family voice. And so maybe speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I did say that I am here, you know, representing myself and not the state of New Jersey. But we have done something that I think is very innovative, and it's why I'm proud to say that I actually work at the Department of Children and Families, because we have created an Office of Family Voice. And the Office of Family Voice is designed to bring in impacted folks, impacted youth who've had the experience of being a part of the child protective family policing system. And, you know, when you have the voices in the room who are on the other side of those phone calls, it changes the entire conversation. And so to understand from the actual communities that we serve what they need, to hear from them instead of us making assumptions about what people need. You know, for years, governments have designed programs for people, right? People in need. And many of those programs have been ineffective because they weren't designed with the people for whom they were supposed to be solving problems. And so it is absolutely pivotal that we bring in people who are impacted by this very system, so that we can learn from them. There is wisdom that is on that other side, and it's critical. And you know, Eleni, you just said like it will be awkward, right, to bring a parent in when you have to make this call. And yet, in doing that, it could be found out that that call is not even necessary, right? We could tap into some other resources in the community that could meet the actual need, as opposed to you know, continuing this carceral approach to caring for people, or it's not really caring for people, but you know, we come into social work with the intention of being helpers. And then because of liability with the organizations that we work with, because of governmental rules and regulations, because of policies, we find ourselves mandated to report that which we really want to remedy. And without family voice, without getting impacted people in the room to have those conversations, many of the solutions that are very easy and simple fixes, you know, wouldn't even be known or discovered. So I think that it's absolutely critical that we figure out, you know, creative ways to get people with lived experience into the room as part of the conversation. When I think about the story that I shared with you all earlier about, you know, having a teacher, or maybe it was the principal of the school, the church school that I was sending my children to, not come to me as a human being, but instead make this mandated call, it completely broke down the relationship, right? And so the solution that was needed wasn't found when that investigation took place. And what needed to change in our family dynamic didn't change as a result of that. That just created more stress and problems for my family. So we really have to get creative about finding solutions and ways to bring in family voice. And recognizing the value that that brings to the table, and that truly and honesty, it's not optional, it's necessary. A lot of the problems that have existed, you know, for decades. And so the solution is to do something different, and we can work toward that by bringing in the voice of those impacted by the system into the conversation. And not only into the conversation, but also sharing power and authority with them to actually make decisions. Power sharing is part of the co-design process if we're actually going to get to a place of changing the outcomes for the people that we intend to serve.
I think one thing that we talked about in our planning meeting too was this culture of policing that is, you know, ever present in schools and clinics and helping circumstances. And one shift that I've seen with an organizer that attends our mandated reporters against mandated reporting meetings, who works at a domestic violence agency, is her activism within her agency. And so what that looked like for her was meeting with the legal counsel of this domestic violence agency to clarify what their policies are around mandated reporting. And they actually found that their agency policy goes beyond the law, right? And when we think about domestic violence in particular, people who are seeking out support from a hotline or a shelter, maybe for the first time, and being reported to CPS, you know, and how that instills a culture, even more fear among survivors, right? And so I think, you know, what our colleague is doing is really important and can be replicated, of meeting with your agency, you know, program council, learning the laws in your state, learning how your agency may actually be going beyond what is within your state's scope, right? Within the legal scope of mandated reporting. And so for her, at her agency, they had more mandated reporters than is legally required by law, right? The law requires, you know, people who have direct contact with children to be a mandated reporter. Their agency required every employee as a mandated reporter, right? So what can you do to clarify your workplace's policy around mandated reporting? If you are, I don't know if we have time for polling, but that's all right. But what can you do to change how your school talks about mandated reporting if you're a student? The mandated supporting curriculum that I mentioned earlier was born out of the idea of students, alumni and faculty, and community partners, right? And it was a student-led effort. Just like the history that I mentioned, the social work students have a long history of organizing the profession, right? There are things that you can do at your school. You can find allies, you can find allied faculty who are interested in pursuing a project to even just talk about mandated reporting. I was talking to a brilliant academic earlier named Brianna Harvey, who actually coined the term family policing. And we were talking about how so much organizing and so much, for example, for her, the term family policing came out of a casual conversation she was having with her colleague, Victoria Copeland, right? So even starting these conversations within your own schools or school districts or agencies is an action towards changing practice or changing the curriculum or changing the way that future social workers understand mandated reporting. There are a number of statewide efforts, like I said, in California, Colorado, New York, and others, I'm sure. But there is a national campaign to repeal CAPTA, which, like I said at the beginning, is the federal law that defines and requires states to have mandatory reporting practices. For more information, you can go to repealcapta.org. We have a day of action actually next week and a congressional briefing, in DC on Wednesday, if you want to tune into that. But there are efforts to move money. We talked about resources, right? And one of the demands of the Repeal CAPTA campaign is to move money from Title I, which is the part of CAPTA that requires mandated reporting, into Title II, which is the part of CAPTA that funds CBCAP, the community-based child abuse program, I believe. And that is flexible funding. So that CBCAP money can actually be used for what families need, which is, doula support, which is pilot programs on guaranteed income, which is, really concrete material supports. So the idea of moving money out of Title I, which requires a policing function, pushes families away from using services, and moving that money to Title II, which is what enhances communities, which builds communities, which gives families what they need. That is one of the core demands of this campaign. I say all that just to kind of bring this macro level lens to this work. There's a lot of movement happening right now around mandated reporting. And I think there's space for everybody to plug into what's already happening, and or start their own initiatives whatever state you might be in.
I want to add to this that Jasmine's talking very specifically around legislative efforts around the policies of mandated reporting and CAPTA. And I think it's also important for us to how do we activate ourselves as social workers to be thinking about legislation that is not, we don't think when we hear about it, we're not oh, mandated reporting, but actually impacts reporting and the family policing system. So all of the legislation right now, and somebody put in the chat around LGBTQ youth. So all the legislation right now that is cutting healthcare to trans youth, that that is having, in Texas, when they're asking asking educators to out students, these are all connected again to actually reporting struggles. And so what does it mean for us to be advocating for trans rights, for us to be advocating for universal childcare, for affordable housing, right? So anti-poverty legislation generally is going to impact the numbers of families that are in the family policing system. And so how do we think broadly too around what is happening in our state, in the cities that we work in, that are really preserving the dignity of the young people that we work with the families that we work with, and the community systems that are already in place. And that might be right, the queer systems that we see that many of us are a part of, right, in this room. And how do we organize around that and make the connections back again to family policing? And I think that we've gotten there to a big extent, I've been amazed in the way that we talk about prison abolition and mass incarceration, that we can connect all of these things into our carceral way of being, but we don't always come back again to family policing and child welfare. And how do we always have to be making those connections and organizing in these different spaces?
I know we got a lot of questions in the chat about how to join mandated reporters against mandated reporting. We post on Instagram about our meetings, but we meet on the first Thursday of each month at 7 to 8:30 Eastern time, which is 5 o'clock Wisconsin time. And so if you follow on Instagram at Beyond Reporting, you can stay, up to date, or you can email beyondmandatedreporting@gmail.com and get on our listserv in that way. And like I said, it's a space where we talk through peer consultation, but also organizing tactics. And I know that we're coming up on time. And, I really want to thank UW-Madison for inviting us. I want to thank you all for your thoughtful questions and participation in the Q&A. And, Jenny for inviting us, and my co-presenters for this presentation. And thank you all for being here. And Jenny, I'll pass it back to you.
Yes, thank you. And I guess you can take your slides off. Appreciate it. And very many thanks to our presenters today and for sharing their time, valuable information, so much information. It was really a rich conversation. And I know a lot of the people listening there were a lot of great comments, people wanting to figure out how to make it work for themselves and where they are. So thank you to everyone in attendance and for being part of the event and your commitment to confront racial injustice. So please watch for a couple emails. One will be an email with a link to complete for the evaluation of today's presentation, and also watch for a separate email about the CEUs. So you'll be getting those two things. And remember that this session, like all of our sessions, are recorded. They'll be up on our conference website as soon as we're able to get everything processed from this week and next week, so that you'll be able to rewatch, as well as if you happen to have a hard time choosing between sessions, there are a couple different ones. So we hope to see you next week, February 2nd, for part 2 of our conference. And if you haven't registered for that, you still can. And you can go to our conference website for more information on that. And again, thank you to everyone here. Thank you to our presenters. And I hope that we'll be able to make many more connections in the future. Very much appreciate it.